By way of introduction, I'm a critical care physician. I've worked for the last 20 years at Kingston General Hospital, and in that context, obviously have seen a lot of death and dying, and have observed that a lot of people are ill prepared for that traumatic life event called death. And unfortunately, we're in a position as healthcare professionals engaging, family members of these now incapacitated patients to make medical decisions, life and death decisions. And so what I wanted to do was as briefly as I can, just share with you, some of the research that we've been doing that highlights deficiencies in the communication and decision-making process, which led to the development and evaluation of the PlanWell Guide. And recognizing that people on the call today have a diverse background and also lots of experience with communication, decision-making, I'd love to get some reaction from you and how this might fit with your workflow. So perhaps just to start with a conceptual framework of the words that we use. We use the word advanced care planning, and unfortunately, I think it's a problem because it encompasses all of what's on this figure, when really what it should mean is sort of that more decontextualized conversation where we're initiating a conversation with a person or a patient about their wishes and preferences, and perhaps most importantly, encouraging and enabling them to nominate someone to make decisions for them in the event that they become incapacitated. So that typically happens in a home or a community-based setting. But as you move to the right of the screen, and this is certainly where I've had more experience working with people and or their surrogates to make decisions about their medical treatment, which we obviously have to be involved as clinicians. There's a process of informed consent that we have to follow to make sure patients are aware of the risk, benefits, trade-offs, et cetera, of the different options available. And it could be said that, advanced care planning is a good preparatory step for these more in-the-moment decisions about goals of care. But I will elaborate a theme that says actually we could be doing more harm than good by doing advanced care planning in a particular way. Regardless of what planning is done, ultimately it needs to impact on forms, medical forms that influence care, and they have to be available at the point of care so that the patient gets care that's consistent with their values and goals. Another sort of simpler way to sort of think of that is advanced care planning precedes goals of care designation, leading to the appropriate care for people when they're serious ill. And I must confess a conflict of interest here. I've been a member of the Speak Up campaign from the very beginning, but I feel like we've been doing the space a disservice by focusing so much on terminal care or end-of-life care. And will argue that what people have trouble with is not death per se. Many older people have their funerals planned, but they don't understand the dying process. And not all serious illness where you become incapacitated leads to death, or at least a certainty of death. And so planning for terminal end-of-life care where that's a certainty is not the same as planning for a period of incapacity where there may be a probability of death, but there may also be a probability of recovery. And so steeping this advanced care planning conversation in end-of-life care does lay people a disservice. And the reason for that is I find 80-year-olds, for example, who say, I don't need to engage in this piece of work because I'm too healthy. So because they're saying, well, I'm not sick, therefore I don't have to plan for my terminal care, where in fact, we want everybody to plan for serious illness where they're incapable of making decisions and we need to rely on surrogates. And that can happen to a 25-year-old as well as an 80-year-old. And so I spend a lot of my time educating people the difference between serious illness and terminal illness. Now, in some of your settings, you may be, in fact, helping people plan and coach them towards terminal illness, and that's fine. And I'm not saying anything about that. But for 90% of advanced care planning, we're actually taking somebody, relatively well, or perhaps living with advanced chronic illness, where they'll have exacerbations of their chronic illness, or they may develop a serious illness where there's not a certainty of death. And we get into this making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, where we don't know, what the outcome will be. And people struggle with that. We ask them about their preferences, and they say, well, it depends on what happens to me. If I'm going to turn out well, then, I want you to do everything. But if I'm going to turn out poorly, why wouldn't you just keep me comfortable, they say. But we're unable to give that kind of clarity around our prognostic response for most people. Now, again, I'm not talking about patients with end stage, stage 4 metastatic cancer who are on a known trajectory towards death. But for most other Canadians, there isn't certainty about what the outcome will be when they develop their serious illness. And so we have to shift the paradigm into making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And I'm not saying this is the best way, but I'm just trying to give an example of how we do that with lay people. That we talk about the weather report and the weatherman. Every morning you wake up, particularly those of you in BC, I'm sure you're curious as to whether it's going to rain today. And so you listen to that, oh, there's a 60% probability of rain, maybe major thunderstorms. And but that's not a certain statement, right? That's a probabilistic statement. And so, whether you're going to wear an umbrella or take an umbrella, or wear a raincoat, you still have to decide how you're going to move through your day given those conditional statements. And so I just use this as a way of explaining to lay people the concept of making decisions under uncertainty. We still are very interested in eliciting their values and preferences under these conditions, but not under conditions of certainty where there's certain death, because their preferences will change. And so it has to be very clear that when we're eliciting values and preferences, it's under this context of medical uncertainty in the context of serious illness. So that's a main point. I'd like to elaborate a couple other main points that cause us trouble when we try and help coach people to the right decisions. And if we're not careful of that, we actually can be moving them in the wrong direction. And my other point will be that patients really aren't clear about what their authentic values are, or perceive that there are potential conflicts between different values on the table for discussion. And let me illustrate what I mean by referring you to a paper we published a few years ago, where we measured values using what I'll call an unconstrained or a simple, rating scale of, hey, is this important to you? We provided them with a list of various values that typically would be important in the context of making decisions around serious illness or at the end of life. And so we got people's ratings of how important things were. We elicited their preferences for different medical treatments, and we looked at the relationship between the two of those. First of all, it was interesting to see that there were a general consensus that values related more to comfort and avoiding machines and death not being prolonged seemingly were the most important. That life be preserved at all costs seemingly was the least important. Looking at those different values ratings, we came up a priori with various relationships, how this value of preserve life at all costs might relate or correlate with a value that says, oh, comfort is the most important. So for example, that would be an inverse correlation, and probably strongly inverse correlation. And so we were able to do that for all of these different values. And what I'm showing you here are the extent to which those correlations actually materialized or were realized. And in fact, there were only 7 of the 18 different correlations that were statistically significant in the expected direction, and most were weak to moderate correlations. Now, I know that's a lot of statistical stuff, but let me explain that in using examples. So here's an example of a positive correlation between living long as possible and the belief that life should be preserved. And so that makes sense that those two ratings of living long as possible and life should be preserved should correlate, but it's a modest correlation coefficient of 0.35. In contrast, we thought that living as long as possible should be negatively correlated with the rating of importance on being comfortable, avoiding machines, that death not be prolonged, that nature should be allowed to take its course. And yet in none of these instances were the ratings of the level of importance of these values were they negatively correlated. In fact, from a patient's perspective, on average, being kept comfortable or being comfortable being the thing that was rated as most important, weakly positively correlated with living as long as possible. So what I'm trying to say is people intrinsically do not see how their expressions of values, when manifest in an unconstrained way, actually can compete or conflict with each other, which isn't that helpful to us as clinicians trying to navigate this space. Moreover, there was no relationship between that which they expressed as being most important to them and their preferences for medical treatment. I'm just showing you the plots that whether you thought, being comfortable, it was important, didn't differ in terms of your choice of comfort care, full medical care, or CPR, or something in between. And we had plots like this for all of those different value statements. And so there was no relationship between expressed values and elicited preferences. And so you kind of think that they should relate, that if I'm one that tends towards more comfort care, that my preference would be then not for CPR. And yet we couldn't demonstrate that relationship. So, gosh, what are the implications of this? That, simple questions like, hey, what's important to you when you think about your end of life care, may not be useful or valid in trying to really say, okay, that's what that person thinks is most important. And we really need to be a bit more sophisticated in our values elicitation. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And we can do it clinically just using words as well, but I'll actually show you the scales that we use in the Plan Well guide. But what I want to stress here on this slide is that, consumer theory says that in order to know how much something is of value, we have to know what people are willing to give up. What is the explicit trade-off, or to use another economic term, opportunity cost of, and how much is that valued in order to achieve this other goal? And so in eliciting values, we need to present them these constraining approaches, or these approaches that make the trade-off very explicit. And this is a scale, for example, where the respondent has to rate, to the left or to the right. What's more important to you? Focusing on prolonging or focusing on quality? And in making that determination, they see that these are at competing ends of the pole, and I can't have my cake and eat it too. Or if they are ambivalent or can't express the leading, then obviously they're saying both of those goals are equally important. And of course that has implications on, it's not that useful for us as clinicians in determining their medical treatment preferences, and may mean that the person has not really thought about this richly, and they may need other values clarification tools to help them think through and determine their leanings. Another example would be the second question that we use in Plan Well Guide in terms of the use of technology at the end of life. Some people wanting, having preferences for a natural death, other people being open to machines and having doctors do all things possible. And so, but you can see that they compete with each other. And so I'm trying to say that this is the best way of eliciting values. You could do that clinically by just asking the question, hey, what type of person, are you the kind of person that wants to focus on the quality of your remaining days versus, the quantity of life or staying alive as long as possible? Are you the type of person that, kind of wants a natural exit strategy, or are you open to the use of technology and machines, when you're seriously ill? And so you don't necessarily have to use these scales, but you have to use it in your language so people see that there are trade-offs. The other major problem with communication decision-making around serious illness is the lack of transparency and reproducibility of how a clinician moves from eliciting a value statement, oh, I want you to keep me as comfortable as possible, to a medical preference or a medical treatment. And so we've tried to make that whole process transparent and more reproducible by connecting now these values to this grid where you can transparently see how those ratings lead or should point towards a particular medical treatment. Sometimes we get a reaction from people when they say, oh, I want you to keep me comfortable, I want a natural death. And then, so we say, that points towards the cell where it's comfort measures only. And then we go through a process of explaining to them what comfort measures means and how that relates to medical care and informed intensive care. And they say, that's not really what I meant. I'm open to, conservative, medical treatment to keep me alive. I thought we were talking about terminal care, so I just wanted you to keep me comfortable. And so it's not that we always get it right on the first go, but it makes the conversation very transparent, and then we can re-educate or redefine people's values in order to make sure they get the medical treatment that's right for them. The other assumption that we make is that people are informed consumers, and we frequently say, what do you want us to do? As if they know what CPR is, or if they know what comfort care is, and in fact they aren't. And I'll just use one example from the CPR literature. I'm sure you're familiar with the idea that most people get their misinformation from TV. When we survey them, these are patients in hospitals who have CPR orders on the chart, and they really don't have a clue about the nature of the treatments related to CPR, nor the outcomes. Most of them don't know what the probability of success will be, and so they're ill-informed consumers, and we ought to stop asking them that question, what do you want us to do? And so what we've done in Plan Well Guide is provide a decision aid where we explicate the risk, benefits, and possible outcomes of the different, major buckets of care: intensive care, medical care, comfort care, and then a special part around resuscitation where we have a video decision aid on what that's like and what's all involved. And so we're trying to, inform people about their medical preferences. So just to circle back here, what I'm really concerned though about in our current approach is that we do some light advanced care planning, treating a person as an autonomous, informed agent who understands their values, and that we take that information and we codify it as a treatment wish, as a pre-specified plan, as an advanced directive, if you will. And if you follow my line of thinking, I feel like we're doing more harm than good, that people are getting the wrong conclusions. I spend a lot of my time in clinic backing people off comfort care because they thought they were signing up for terminal care, or the older client who doesn't really understand what they signed up, and I'm moving them off R1 in our language, which is people who have signed up for everything, including CPR. And when they really understand the risks and benefits, it's because they didn't understand those things, but once they do now, they change their preferences. But just to stress that most people come into my environment thinking that they've done advanced care planning, therefore they know what they want, when nothing could be further from the truth. And so I'm motivated to build out better tools that help people in a more informed and authentic way establish their values and preferences. I use this graphic in Plan Well Guide to really stress the point that it's not really just about what you want. That in fact your advanced care planning, which is done in a decontextualized space, needs to be contextualized to the medical problem. And your doctor, it plays an important role in that determination of your medical problem and your prognosis, and therefore the indication of whether your preferences are actually a good fit. And so we talk a lot about shared decision making, where you have to collaborate with your physician to make that decision. I get a little distressed when I observe clinicians because they violate a lot of the hallmarks of shared decision making. I use this spectrum here to suggest that there's a range of different roles that patients want to play when they make decisions related to serious illness, from being actively involved in making their decisions to passively involved in making their decisions to, in the middle, just shared decision making. If I take that sort of line and I break it into 5 pieces, I come up with these 5 categories that describe the role that patients or family members as surrogates want to play in making serious decisions. And as I read through these, think about the patients that you work with, and what your experience is in terms of what the most common preferred role that people want to play when making decisions about serious illness. Is it A, that I prefer to make the decision about the treatment which I will receive? B, I prefer to make the final decision about the treatment, but seriously consider my doctor's opinion. C, I prefer that my doctor and I share responsibility for deciding. D, I prefer the doctor to make the final decision, but I really want him or her to consider my opinion. Or E, I prefer to leave all decisions to my doctor. And so if we were in an open forum, I'd take a solicitation from you as to what your most, what your experience is in terms of the preferred role that patients want to play. But here's our experience in seriously ill hospitalized patients measuring their decisional role preferences. And the first thing you'll note is that there's a variety of preferences. And so we can't always just approach this in one way, because some people will want to be active, some people will want to be passive, but you can see that the majority of people cluster in the shared decision-making approach. And so that might be the safest way to start the decisional conversation so that you're matching the patient's preferred role. Which means you have to be very careful with your language strategy. And so when you say something like, okay, we could do treatment B or treatment A, what do you want us to do? You're putting decisional responsibility on the shoulders of that patient, when in fact the majority of them will not want that responsibility, and we're only increasing now their stress and anxiety by our use of language. And so part of what I've been doing for the last 20 years is trying to educate healthcare professionals on how language matters and how to use language strategies to support shared decision making. I won't go through these in detail. I will make reference to a guide, a conversation guide, which we've developed and is posted on the healthcare professional page of PlanWell Guide as well. But all of this to say, I think people need greater support in shared decision making, and that's why we've evolved this concept of PlanWell Guide. I used this talk at an international end-of-life meeting recently, and it wasn't that well received, because I was trying to say, hey, this is less about patient autonomy and more about shared decision making and collaborating with healthcare professionals. This is less about end-of-life care and more about serious illness. And we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we optimally help lay people make decisions under conditions of this uncertainty. And I'm sort of rejecting this idea that it's a simple conversation. No, it's in fact a lot more nuanced and detailed and sophisticated in order to help people plan to get the care that's right for them, and better tools are needed than simple conversation starters. And so you can imagine if I'm in a room with a bunch of advanced care planning enthusiasts who are all about the conversation and proposing the patient be an autonomous decision maker, how that didn't go over so well. But anyway, I share that with you just as an anecdote. Let me close by just walking through quickly PlanWell. Maybe you've already looked at it. We have a landing page that then gets into the meat, where we have various tabs that explain about the website. And then the money really is in these tabs related to explaining serious illness, going through that values clarification process, and then the decision aid around the different types of care. And then they would need to sort of actually log in and begin the process of making their plan, where they'll rate their values on those value scales that I showed you, elicit a preference or document their medical preference, aided by that grid that I already showed you. And then there's space for them to document their substitute decision maker and any residual questions. So the output from a planning exercise is not a medical decision made, but rather a collaboration tool with their physician. So they go with this, what we call Dear Doctor letter, and they then engage a clinician or a nurse practitioner to actually get the medical order in the form that the healthcare system would use to codify those medical orders. Again, you may say, oh, there's lots of other tools out there. What's new or what's different about this one? Well, I kind of tried to hit these highlights as I went through the presentation, that as far as I know, we're one of the only ones that discriminate between terminal care and planning for serious illness, that help people, think through and make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. We're one of the only ones that use a constrained values clarification tool. We originated this grid, which helps make the conversation very transparent. And we've created the first in class and perhaps best in class decision aid, where we're educating people on the difference between, resuscitative medicine, medical care, and comfort care. We have done a randomized controlled trial. I'm just working on getting that paper published, where we've compared this planning process to usual care, thinking that this planning process would not only improve usual care, but that it would reduce the time that the clinician, the doctor, has to spend with the patient. Oh, by the way, that's a big barrier for at least primary care physicians, if not acute care physicians, maybe even long-term care physicians, to engage with their clients, is the time and the emotional cost spent. So I'll just move through quickly the plan well process versus usual care. We had to come back and the physician filled out an assessment, and then we phoned them 12 months later to say, or 12 weeks later rather, to say, hey, what was your experience like? What is your goals of care? And what we were able to show is that following the plan well guide process, there tended to be greater concordance between what the medical order codified in the record compared to their expressed preference. So when those two are in alignment, we call that concordance. Tended to be greater concordance in the intervention group. There were certainly fewer patients in the intervention group who wanted CPR. Patients tended to be better informed and felt more support from their physicians. And from a physician's point of view, the physicians concurred that these patients who had been through Plan Well Guide tended to be more informed and have a clearer sense of their values, and they were able to spend less time with their patients. We've created several tools to help operationalize Plan Well Guide in various settings. One are posters and pocket cards, just to sort of create that, poster on the wall or a pocket card handout to a person to create that level of awareness. We strongly believe that to the extent that a clinician engages a person and says, you need to do this, you should go do this. And so we've developed a prescription pad where the patient could be sent home to do the planning process offline, and then come back and see the clinician to fill out those medical forms. We recognize that not everybody is web savvy, and perhaps our target audience, of those 80-year-olds who we think this is most important, is, may not really groove with the internet. My experience is most of those patients whose their substitute decision maker is a younger son or daughter who are internet savvy, and so we strongly encourage them to do it together. And for those that just don't want to work with the internet, we do have this reduced to writing in a pamphlet, where the last 4 pages of the pamphlet are the essence of the Dear Doctor letter. So this is what it's supposed to kind of look like, where the clinician engages the patient to reflect and to work through their plan. They print it off, they go talk to their family, or they have done it with their family member. They present it back to their doctor to get their medical orders for the use or non-use of life-sustaining treatments, so they get the care that's right for them. I made reference to this communication guide. which is also freely available on the website for clinicians, so that they can better, be on the receiving end of those Dear Doctor letters, and on a shared decision-making model, help patients get the treatment that's right for them. I guess I know I have a diverse audience, but I'll use Alberta as an example. These forms may differ by province, obviously, but to me, an optimally prepared person is one that has done the goals of care designation form that the doctor fills out and determines that medical order for the use or non-use of life-sustaining treatments, that is informed by the Dear Doctor letter or the planning exercise on Plan Well Guide, and inclusive of that is then the personal directive, where legally you're naming your agent. And those three documents should be stored and kept together. In Alberta, we use green sleeves as the analog way sort of to do that. So that's really all I wanted to say. I hope that wasn't too long. I felt like it was important that I explain the background of what our research had shown, the problems and deficiencies, and why we've developed what we've developed as a new and first-in-class sort of planning tool for people to really get their goals of care, or whatever language you use, to codify their medical orders for the use or non-use of life-sustaining treatments.